Welcome to Season 3 of the Questions With podcast, hosted by Quest Ventures, the top venture capital fund in Asia. I am your host, April Ongvania, and through this season, I aim to uncover inspiring stories of notable entrepreneurs across Asia who have incorporated ESG values and achieving impact into their business model. Follow me on a journey of discovery as I speak to accomplished entrepreneurs from various sectors, ranging from fashion to finance. When we think about telehealth, what comes to mind? I'm sure most of us would be recalling our own experiences of Zoom sessions with doctors, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over at ZoomVet, the idea of telehealth has been reimagined, this time for our furry best friends. On this episode, we have the honor to speak to Athena Lee, the CEO and co-founder of ZoomVet, a company focused on telehealth and medicine delivery services for pets. Founded in 2019, their business has since skyrocketed quickly, establishing a name for themselves in the pet industry. Today, I hope to uncover the secret behind their success and how placing affordability and accessibility as a priority remains a winning formula for ZoomVet. Hi, Athena. Welcome to the Questions With podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me here, April.
Wonderful. It's really interesting to meet with entrepreneurs and founders in this space, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation we're going to have. Now, just to get started, I wanted to share, or at least allow you to share, about your own background, just a little bit of an introduction. I see that in your early career, you were an analyst at Moody's Investor Service and an associate director at UBS. So, what made you decide to pivot away from these roles and become an entrepreneur yourself?
I think that when a lot of people look at my career progression, one thing they'll notice is that there were a lot of changes. And I would say that there wasn't really a pivot. I think throughout my career, I've always gravitated towards things that I'm really interested in. So even when I was younger, one of the first things that I had was an Apple computer. So I had one before most people had them, right? And it's technology is just something that has always played a very big role in my life. So even in university, was always collecting, was always dabbling with different types of tech. And then within my career as well, even though I was working in finance, I would always take up projects that were also tech related as well. So when I had the opportunity to join a startup when I was in Hong Kong, definitely jumped at it. I was already in the finance industry for at least 10 years at that point in time, and I was ready for a change. And so I had joined a later stage company called Givergy in Hong Kong as a country head. And I think that was really quite pivotal for me. It was a massive change from what I was doing. So I jumped from working at MNCs to something that was quite a lot more unstructured. But I loved it, right? I loved being very hands-on. I loved having to problem solve in different areas of work every single day, from sales to just management to figuring out how to set up payroll. And so from then on out, I've chosen roles that require me to wear many hats and require me to really get my hands dirty.
I know what you are saying when it's about multiple hats. So do you think that there is a certain personality or a background that fits into the role of an entrepreneur?
I don't think there's necessarily any specific background. I've met many different types of entrepreneurs, at different stages, different cultures, different races, nationalities. And I would say that it's more of a personality type. If you like challenges, if you handle stress, handle difficult situations well and welcome them, then you're definitely suited to be an entrepreneur. I think you come across a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges in the course of starting a business. And so you definitely need to be able to weather that. And the most successful entrepreneurs I know aren't the ones that come from specific backgrounds, aren't the ones who are the smartest in the room necessarily, but really are the ones who have that grit to get through, difficult times.
Indeed. perhaps a personal question, or at least from your own experience, what do you think is the hardest part of being an entrepreneur?
I would say it's definitely managing relationships. There's definitely so many things that are great, but also hard about being an entrepreneur. But I think the most difficult is always having to weather and go through different stages of relationships, whether it's with your founder, whether it's with your investors, your suppliers, your partners. Many of these relationships start off very exciting, very happy. But I think it's inevitable that you will come across situations that become a little bit tricky. And so having to deliver bad news, having to make a mistake, especially when it comes to your partners or your investors, it's always very difficult. But I think that once you get through them, those relationships do become stronger. So I think there's always a silver lining.
That's right. I mean, it's definitely a very interesting ride as an entrepreneur with all its ups and downs. And, the tech industry or the startup industry has seen rapid growth over the recent years, yet the average percentage of female founders is only around 15%. So I'd like to ask if you could share with us your experience being a female founder or entrepreneur. Do you think gender has any part to play at all when it comes to entrepreneurship?
I get this question a lot, and it's always very difficult for me to answer. And I would say that in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to think about gender, when it comes to entrepreneurship. But I think the numbers do say a lot about the state of, entrepreneurship right now. But that said, I would say that the framework of gender and entrepreneurship has evolved quite drastically since the pandemic, right? As someone who founded a company post 2019, I had the advantage of receiving a lot of support as a result of COVID. And so I am quite thankful for that. And the reality is that there are many ways to define an entrepreneur based on culture, race, gender. And I think that each of these different definitions come with its own set of challenges. So I wouldn't say that the gender one is especially, important or especially needs particular attention, right? But I would say that, as someone who's a little bit older coming into being a founder, it took me many years, right? And I've climbed quite a steep slope to get to where I am today. And I think that when you're thinking about just the gender, right? It's really more about providing more support from youth, right? I think providing females with more encouragement to take on new challenges, to take the road less traveled, and really to voice their ideas is something that needs to be supported a little bit more from an early stage. And it's not just about entrepreneurship, right? But it's about encouraging females to take on bigger, better roles, and to have the confidence to do that.
Thank you for pointing that out and sharing that insight. And I wanted to also ask in particular, do you have any specific experience or challenge that you face as a female entrepreneur?
I would say challenges, but I have anecdotes, right? And I think they're just more amusing to me. So I have great investors, right? I get along with them really well, but I do see that the way they would, socialize with me is usually quite different from how they would socialize with my male counterparts. So something I bring up always is that when they're talking to men or male founders, it'd be like, hey, let's go out for a cigar, let's go out for drinks and have a night out. Whereas when it comes to me and my co-founder, who's also female, they tend to be a little bit more careful. So instead of drinks, they'd be like, hey, let's go for coffee, right? Or let's do something a little bit more kosher or a little bit more healthy. So I think that anecdotally, it's amusing, right? But I do think that sometimes we do miss out on certain opportunities because we don't have the same types of networking experiences or the same type of social interactions with investors, with partners.
Definitely, we would need more doors to be opened and maybe others to help you knock on those doors as well. So I can agree with that. But yeah, I mean, maybe also in terms of the mindset and the the encouragement of women or among women is important. So perhaps you can share a little bit of insight or a message to anyone here listening to this podcast that is an aspiring founder, entrepreneur, maybe a young girl also, maybe looking up to some female founders that are starting their ventures. Any words for them?
I think be encouraging, right? Don't shoot down ideas. I think generally people don't necessarily need you to criticize their ideas or to rationalize them. I think a lot of times when someone is sharing an idea with you, they're doing it because they're excited, or you assume that they've done their homework and that they know a little bit about what they're doing. So it's really about feeling that excitement with them and helping them problem solve to think bigger, to help them get to where they need to be. So I think generally just be supportive. I think that's the most important thing.
I agree. And perhaps you can share also your story and bringing your idea to life, bringing it to market. What was, let's say, the biggest challenge you faced?
So many, right? But I would say that the biggest challenge has definitely been working within a very niche industry. So traditionally, I come from fairly traditional industries, so finance first, then healthcare. And even though they are very traditional, historically, there's just been more new ideas and more support of these new ideas coming into the world. But pet care has been quite small and more of an afterthought when it comes to traditional healthcare. So we got a lot of rejections, from regulators, from existing providers, from existing players like pharmaceuticals who have been doing things a certain way, don't feel like there needs to be any change. So as a new player, how do you come into an ecosystem and try to convince them that a new modality would work, right? But I think it's really about starting small and knowing who your stakeholders are. So for us, we were always quite clear. We started this company because both my co-founder and I are pet owners, and we wanted a very specific experience. And we were able to talk to a lot of other pet owners as well, who shared our sentiments about how they wanted to manage their pet's healthcare, right? And that's really what gave us the courage to do what we needed to do. And so, when we run ZoomVet and in the decisions that we make, we always put the pet owners first. Those are our main stakeholders. And despite the challenges, despite the pushback we may get from the industry, I think what we're coming in to do is to create a reasonable solution that would fit both the providers and the pet owners.
That's true. And I guess sometimes you have to be your own customer, right? So that you know what exactly the market needs. So that's very interesting indeed, that this is also really a personal story of yours, how you came about with your startup. Now, how has placing affordability and accessibility in the design of your service at the forefront of your business? How did that, help you scale?
So for us, we put ourselves first, right? So we were pet owners. We were consumers of pet healthcare. So something that we understood was that transparency is very important to users. And I think that as pet owners are becoming more savvy, what they want is to make informed decisions. The reality is that when it comes to healthcare, and specifically pet healthcare, there hasn't been a lot of transparency. Generally, when you're paying for products, when you're paying for services, that information is quite opaque. So a lot of times as a pet owner consuming these types of services, I feel like I'm in a black box and I don't feel like I have options or the right to really steer the course that I would want to take. And we just don't believe that's right. So what we're trying to offer is true value, right? We want to bring affordability, but also knowledge and accessibility, and balancing all these different factors to create a better experience.
That's amazing. And it's great also about niche markets is that you can really talk to a community of users. And I'm sure you have quite a strong feedback loop in this whole journey. So that's really great. Now, from at your standpoint or where you stand now, How do you envision your journey going forward?
Yeah. So again, the primary reason why we started ZoomVet is because we are pet owners ourselves, right? And so what we effectively want to create is a full end-to-end journey. So we started with the modality of telemedicine for two reasons. One is because it didn't exist, right? We wanted instant access. We wanted to be able to talk to a vet whenever we wanted, whenever it was convenient for us. But the other side of that is also we wanted to ensure that we were able to manage quality of care as well. Realistically, right now, the biggest problem when it comes to veterinary care is the lack of vets and also the lack of trained vets. The population of pets is just growing much faster than there are veterinarians in the market, right? So how do you create a solution for that? I think technology will become a very big part of being able to fulfill the demand that is coming into the market. But that said, being then able to match them with the right offline experiences was also quite important. So what we're working towards is creating a meaningful integration between this online to offline type of customer journey. In fact, we have just recently acquired a clinic, and what we're doing is creating a sort of new paradigm for how a pet owner will continue to get servicing, whether it's after an online or an offline touch point.
Of course, we are already in that hybrid age of products and services. So you're definitely doing that for your niche industry. And, you know, we talk about hybrid work and hybrid businesses. This really all started or grew during the pandemic. And I guess that was also a great opportunity for you and your co-founder, Grace, to do this. But that also meant a lot of uncertainty starting a startup during these times. So how did you both navigate this volatile and uncertain time to push for your own startup?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? And there's two parts to this equation. So I'd say that the difficulty obviously is the commercial side of it, right? Having to build a business, having to make sure things were working, despite the fact that there were a lot of limitations during COVID. But then there's also the psychological side of it, right? I would say that the commercial side of it, at least for me, was fairly straightforward. I think it's one about making sure you have robust operations. I think when it comes to healthcare, quality of care is really important. You need to make sure that you're doing right by your patients, in our case, their pets, right? So I think initially, even before we launched, we had spent a good 3 to 4 months setting up our operations, finding the right vet, onboarding them, making sure we had access to supply chain of medications, that we had referral partners in case our pet patients needed an onward journey to an in-person clinic, right? So that was easy. I mean, regardless of whether there is a pandemic or not, care is care. And I think we were pretty much set on how that telemedicine journey would work. I would say the most difficult challenges was probably more on the psychological side, right? It was a new business. We hardly had a team. I think in total, we had about 3 people from the get-go. So me, Grace, and someone else was working with us. And we suddenly were thrown into this hybrid work situation. So it was lockdown. We weren't really able to see each other, let alone get to know each other, right, as founders. So I think that initial time of, having to learn how to communicate, learning how to even debate, right, ideas. What are we going to do if we had disagreements? How do we settle that? Was quite difficult for us. But what we committed to doing during that time was to work on communication, right? I think we realized fairly early on that the founder relationship is probably something that can make or break a startup. So we needed to work on it. It was really difficult at first, right? It was almost like relationship counseling, but we went through the journey of trying to understand our personalities, our communication styles. And I think ever since then, it's been a lot easier, right? And even though things are still challenging and there's still a lot of uncertainty, at the very least, because founders are able to communicate well, we are then also able to sort of roll that down to the way the team communicates And I think something that we focus a lot on is mutual respect. So that's always been something that has pulled us together, even through very uncertain times.
Thank you so much for sharing that founder's journey, especially smacked in the middle of history's a historical pandemic. And kudos to you for really pushing forward and meeting the success that you already have now. And maybe a step back, going to your actual product and service. And despite all the challenges in building this together, I know online, what was it like coming up with everything from brainstorming to prototyping? What were the mistakes? How did you validate? And how was that journey in the very early stages?
Yeah, feels like a very long time ago. But in a way, when we came up with the idea, it was almost like a fully formed child, right? So we knew already what we needed. I think we were fairly experienced already as pet owners. To a certain degree, we had gone to vets, we had talked to them, gotten medications. So by and large, we had a pretty good idea. And prototyping was also fairly simple because we came from a healthcare background. We already knew how telemedicine worked. But I would say that the biggest mistakes that we had come to realize later on was the fact that we were trying to model and fit this whole solution into a human healthcare mold, whereas pet care is much more different, much more nuanced. So it didn't really work out quite as well. And so having to realize that, cats and dogs are actually quite different. And we need to create different types of workflows for them was a little bit shocking, a little bit surprising for us. But it took us about 2 years to really perfect the flow. So once we had created the prototype, it worked, it was fine, right? But it wasn't perfect. And I think even now we're still evolving and trying to make the platform a little bit more usable for pets specifically.
Indeed, you're in a very niche market, as we said earlier. Do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage as a startup?
I think both, right? I try not to look at it from that perspective. I think every disadvantage is always an opportunity, right? So on the one hand, this being a very niche industry, is difficult in the sense that it's hard to find support, right? You have a lot of naysayers, you have a lot of people who come to you that don't really believe in what you're trying to do, which I think psychologically is always very difficult. But that said, I think we took a fairly academic approach when we launched the event. So we are very passionate about animals, and this is something that we did out of passion, right? At the same time, we also saw a very big opportunity. So Grace, my co-founder, is a human doctor. I was working at a telemedicine provider before. And the reality when it comes to human healthcare is that it's very saturated, right? Whereas if you start looking at the pet market, it's just exploded. It's grown so quickly. And the interesting part of it is that there aren't that many competitors. There aren't that many players. And so niche it is, but definitely a lot of room to grow. I think the addressable market is growing year on year. People spend beyond their means, right, for pet care. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity there.
That's so true. And it's actually very interesting also to know that you have actually come up with this idea and raised funds or used a pool of funds from family and friends. Do you think that was a strategic decision?
Yeah, I suppose. I think we were very excited about the idea, and we knew that it was something that could scale fairly quickly. There, again, weren't that many players in the market. And because regulations were a little bit more friendly towards what we're doing, it's a little bit easier for us to scale across region. There isn't the limitation of jurisdiction per se. So even looking at what we're doing right now, we have clients from everywhere in the world, right? Still mainly in Southeast Asia, but surprisingly, we have requests coming in from the US, from Australia. So I think generally pet owners from around the world are just looking for solutions like ours. And we saw this from a fairly early stage. So even after our first few consults, we started seeing a lot of traffic coming in from overseas. And that's really what convinced us that it made sense for us to start fundraising and to expand as quickly as possible.
All right, so you're mainly in Asia right now, but you are looking into expanding in other regions. How different or similar have the experiences been in terms of you reaching out to other markets?
So in terms of response, I would say that it really depends, right? I would say Western cultures, so we go to the US, if we go to Australia, vets there tend to be a little bit more open-minded when it comes to telemedicine. I think partially because they've been doing it for quite a number of years. And there is that issue of sort of, more space, right? There are big issues when it comes to accessibility in other markets, which we don't have in Singapore. So I would say that the biggest pushback we've gotten is definitely from Singaporean vets. So a little bit different, but I would say that from a user perspective, similar. I think people here in Singapore have been as embracing of what we're trying to do as they are in other parts of the world.
So what do you think is the greatest opportunity and threat in the pet and pet telehealth industry?
I would say that the biggest opportunity is the I think cultural perspective on pets, right? So even in my parents' generation, I was never allowed to have pets. Especially in Asia, I think that pets is definitely a new phenomenon. So we are becoming more embracing. In fact, we are now considering them part of our family, right? And so with that, people are willing to spend, they see the value in healthcare. So that's definitely the opportunity for us. I would say that the biggest threat would be regulations. And we're already starting to see that a little bit more now. We need to make sure that the regulations make sense, right? That they are supportive of different modalities and they are focused on one thing, which is improving quality of care. I think when you have protectionist policies are coming in just to protect a certain group of service providers, then that gets a little bit more tricky. And we are sort of going through that right now. But I think luckily in Southeast Asia, the regulators here have been a little bit more embracing about working with vendors like ours and ensuring that they are coming up with reasonable types of laws around how telemedicine can be operated.
Definitely. It's really about policy becoming reality as well, apart from really that arduous task of getting those policies in place. And kudos to you to actually being one of the pioneers in this industry and trying to push for pet care and your services. So maybe as we take a look at ESG and how there is an increasing focus on it, especially around the world, how do you foresee the future of your industry, both pet and pet telehealth? How does it look like in the future?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? Because this is something that we're thinking a lot more about. And in fact, something that we talk to a lot of stakeholders and regulators about as well. I think what a lot of people don't know is that beyond just pets, ZoomVet actually serves a wider animal community. So something that we started doing in Q4 of last year was to provide healthcare for aquaculture farms as well. And something that we see that is very core to what we're doing is that we are creating a electronic health record layer for healthcare data of animals generally. And what we want is to provide more insight into things like diseases, pathogens, general healthcare of the animal population, and ideally how it can affect the human population as well, right? I think post-pandemic, this is something that everyone wants to know, but unfortunately the information just isn't there. So we think that having this digital touch point is really quite important, and not only does it centralize data and allows us to do more meaningful analysis, but it also embraces a bigger population. The reality is that we just don't have enough providers to be able to service the entire animal health care, the animal population, right, in the world. So a service like ours brings the network a little bit closer to home for stakeholders like farmers, for pet owners. And so I think there are very big environmental implications of what we're trying to do. And we are very open to working with policymakers, with regulators, to ensure the safety of our population.
Very interesting and very relevant indeed. So I do hope you get some progress in that regard. But I'm sure you've had roadblocks as well. So what's the greatest or biggest roadblock so far?
Many, right? I would say that we are trying to build a digital network, right? So we want to connect specialists, so animal specialists to animal caretakers, right? Those are the generic terms that we try to use. But the fact is that there just aren't enough of them. And so it's been fairly difficult for us actually to onboard a sufficient amount to meet the demand that is coming in. So we are trying to embrace technology. I think ChatGPT has been a godsend, right, to a lot of what we're doing. Not so much in that it can replace providers, but what it allows us to do is to streamline a lot of processes. And so we are trying to use technology to see how we can collect information, to parse that information more quickly, so that we can save the time of providers and allow them to focus on the areas that they do well, which is diagnosis, treatment recommendation. So I'd say that the roadblock is really in one, being able to collect enough of these sort of decision makers. And two is sort of safely integrating things like AI and technology into the process of diagnosis.
For sure, there's a lot of disruption going on with AI, but I also think it is a tool, a great tool to sort of accelerate the progress you're making. So how would you paint a picture of this industry, maybe 5 years, 10 years time?
That's the $1 million question, right? But I think what we're going to see is definitely a lot more consolidation. Right now, when it comes to animal care, it's very decentralized. And I would say that there just isn't enough being done to improve care for animals. So what I think is exciting is that with more attention being brought into this area, whether it's because of more fundraising in pet care or in aquaculture, what it means is that there are just more people paying attention to how we are taking care of this segment of the population. So I think that with this consolidation, it means that we will have more end-to-end journeys that are a lot more meaningful, that can get us to decisions to action a lot more quickly. Whereas now that just isn't possible.
That's true. So what do you think has been the most important factor that contributed to your success as a team so far?
I think internally, we focus a lot on our core value, which is respect, right? I think that in order for a team to work together, they have to feel psychological safety, but also feel like there is progression, right? And I think a lot of times it has to do with team dynamic and how it works together. So I think that's something that has driven us for a very long time, and has made our team work very effectively together. I think the other thing is focusing on mental health. So I think as founders, it's oftentimes very difficult to separate life from work, right? It just merges into one thing. But we've always found that if we take the time to take care of, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, we actually become better managers and better founders. So I think, it's never too early for someone to focus on that. I think it's sort of this misnomer that you don't think about these things until you're successful, right? I think that's already too late.
I couldn't agree more with your, I would say, prioritization of mental health, especially with your team, and it does strengthen that dynamic. How about mentors and supporters? Do you have any? How do you think that has helped you as a leader or as a startup founder?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that we seek mentors per se, right? But there are a lot of people that come into our lives, either because they're in the industry or they're very interested in what we're doing, or it's, someone we've worked with before. And in areas where we don't have expertise, right? So Grace and I don't come from a marketing background. We don't come from, a growth background per se, but we've been able to find, counterparts within these particular industries that have been able to help us quite a bit. So I think, especially early on when the team was small and we had to do everything ourselves, we sought advice from everywhere, right? And so we don't have just one mentor, we have many out there who have helped us so much along the way. And I think that has really helped us to grow as well.
That's great to hear. And definitely it's important to surround yourself with people that can be a source of support in your journey. Now, maybe a last question for you. Maybe you can share what is one piece of advice you have for aspiring entrepreneurs?
Oof, okay. I would say for aspiring entrepreneurs, a lot of founders or a lot of aspiring founders sort of jump into the startup world without clarity, right? And I think that's really quite important. You need to know why you're doing what you're doing. You need to have a fairly clear idea of what you're trying to bring to the world. And you need to know that what you're trying to create will make an impact. So I'd say go into it with an outcome in mind. I think that's really quite important, and stick by that, right? As an entrepreneur myself, there are a lot of things that come along that might tempt you to pivot or take on more than you can chew. But I think if you have one clear North Star, if you're very clear about the mission that you're trying to achieve, that is very helpful and can get you to where you need to be a lot faster.
I wish there was more time for us to have a chat. Amazing stories that you've shared. Thank you so much, Athena, for joining us on this episode. And thank you to everyone tuning into this episode of Questions with, of course, Zumba, featuring the brand's co-founder, Athena Lee. So for more episodes like this, be sure to hit the follow button on whichever platform you're listening from. I am your host, April Ongvanyo. Till next time.